Okay. Okay, so now we have understood that what we are going to study today. So we start with the first slide. Now, when we are talking about the analysis of political risk. See what happens generally when we're talking about political risk. It is something which has the potential to actually affect the business and the transnational cooperations which are existing to a very, very large extent, right? And it can be basically divided into two aspects. The first one of it is the instability of the host government, and the second one is the intervention by the host government. Now, when we're talking about instability of the host government, right, basically it means that something which is like you have a government ruling the economy, or I should say seeing over an economy, but there's no stability in the tenure in which they are kind of handling things, right? Luckily we have not witnessed anything like that happening in the center for India in the recent few years. There has been a quite a stable government at the center, and whereas when I talk about things which have been happening in the state level, we know that something or the other is happening at the state level, like some person resigns and then the other person comes up and etc. So we have been witnessing those kind of sorts there also, right? So now, when we are talking about this particular aspect, instability of the host government, this could create situations like what can happen when, for example, when UPA was into power, right? And after that, when, say, your BJP came into power, the way they have taken things forward is quite different. The ideologies of the governments are quite different, right? They do not tend to match, right? Somebody has a very positive aspect on FDI, the other party does not hold a very positive aspect on FDI. Or what happens generally when they are into the opposition, they not prefer FDI, but when they come into the power, they realize that FDI is only means to actually help your economy to grow at the same time, because you need foreign exchange, right? You need to have a good balance of payment account, otherwise your currency would devalue in the international market. So you realize that when you are into the power. So any kind of instability in the host government can adversely affect the MNC that is operating in that particular country, right? I hope we are clear on this particular point. The second one which we have is intervention by the host government. Now, when we're talking about intervention by the host government, see, instability is something which is there because of maybe the governmental issues which are happening. Now, intervention is something which the government might be doing intentionally for the perspective of actually ensuring national interest, or the other reasons could be because they are not liking them. In terms of, it can be like this particular MNC was allowed a certain degree of commission previously into the UPA when UPA was into power, and then eventually when BJP came into power, they don't like this MNC much, or they do not want to do any kind of favor to this MNC, so they would unjustifiably just intervene in their operations and make their life hell and make it difficult for them to operate, right? So that is what I intend to describe you. Intervention can be from two perspectives: one for the national favor interest, and the other can be from the perspective of ensuring that you are making the life difficult for the MNC which is operating in your country. Right. Now, this intervention can be in the following types, which we have just written. Now, see, these are all terms which need to be explained, right? I could not give the wholesome explanation in the slide. I've just mentioned the points. I'll just explain you in fast. Now, when we're talking about ownership restrictions, Now, these ownership restrictions are like, I'll explain you, I'll give you an example. There was a time in India when we were required to have that कि अगर कोई इंटरनेशनल अलायंस हो रहा है, मतलब जॉइंट वेंचर हो रहा है, और if there's any kind of like say investment coming, the major holding of it would be by the local brand only, or the local entity, the domestic brand. So out of 100, if the 51% is through a local domestic brand, so we would always have an upper edge. But with time, we have seen that the trend is changing a bit, right? The ownership restrictions have to be kind of liberalized to ensure that your economy is more open and considered as to be a more global economy. But the government can still use their power to intervene into the operations of the MNCs which are operating in the host government, in the host country. Now, the second one which we're talking about is the trade restrictions. Now, this particular point is something which we have studied in length in our second unit under the concept of tariff and non-tariff barriers, right? We had studied n number of tariff barriers, we had studied n number of non-tariff barriers, right? And how these kind of restrictions can actually regulate the kind of trade that happens between two nations. When we know that we are not getting that particular favor, in terms of, we know that there has been a case of China dumping in their commodities or quantities or products into the international markets, not even only in India but otherwise also. So we have anti-dumping duty and etc. So there are trade restrictions which can ensure the same. So this is something which is done to ensure that the domestic market is still at the same power, and the international products are not something which are, say, overpowering them. The third point which we are talking about is exchange restrictions. Now, when we're talking about exchange restrictions, what happens generally, not every country's currency is something which is very strong, right? And at the same time, not every country has hard cash, right? You might be having certain shortages of the same. So in that case, what do you actually propose to the other countries when you trade with them is, you trade with them on the terms like, "Ki, let's counter trade," in terms of, if you are giving me another, say, if I'm importing from you palm oil, I'll export to you another XYZ commodity which I am good at producing, right? So this is particularly kind of exchange restrictions which the government would impose, right? So this is done to ensure that, because we are not very strong with our cash holding, the currency holding, so we can do that. The second is the repatriation of profits. What happens is, every like say an MNC which is operating in India, right, does not give the entire revenue or profit to the Indian government. No, of course they would never do that. So there's a percentage which is fixed, and that percentage is fixed when when that particular MNC is coming into that particular country, right? And that percentage is like the percentage of profits which they would be allowed to take back. Now, this percentage is not something which would remain the same across years of span. Of course, it is going to change, because see, if a country came into India in 1991 and the percentage decided at that time was 5%, and now the inflation rate is something which has gone so high, the government and the trends of things have changed considerably. So of course that particular rate is being revised. But अगर हम repatriation of profits की percentage बहुत कम रख दें कि आप वापस लेके जो जाओगे, that will be hardly like another 17 or 20%. So they would be like, what is the motive of doing business in an economy when you're not able to take back profits to your home country? So for them, that host country would be not very interesting. The next which we have is operating restrictions. Now, operating restrictions is basically the restrictions on employment of foreign personnel and environmental control. Now, I'll explain you this with an example. Uh, I don't expect that. वैसे most of the people would not have opened the presentation which is being sent by Jatin sir, right? So basically, that particular topic is about global human resource management, right? And why I am taking out this particular aspect for this particular point is, what happens generally, there are different kind of agreements which are made by the MNC and the host government, that when you are coming and operating in our country, right, you will not do it like all the top management positions, all the top officials will be coming from your home country, because that is kind of very wrong, right? You're not giving that advantage for the people, or you are making it a point, you're being biased, that you are keeping or restoring all the top management level positions. The director level positions, of course, would be by the home government, but all the top official levels and the supervisory level positions are being held by the people of your country, and you're just recruiting the people from the host country for entry level positions. This is not allowed, right? The government makes it very clear to them in the beginning only. So these are kind of restrictions for them, which can be a hindrance in the long run. And if somebody believes that no, Indian people are not capable for that reason for an XYZ profile, so they would feel that key, what is this happening, right? This is not letting me work to my at most level. So this can be a restriction in the employment of foreign personnel based from home country into that particular host country. Now, the environmental control measures could be like you keep a check on the kind of disposal of waste which is done by them and etc. And you make it a point that you're very much in point, or I should say, you try to regulate it to even a greater extent in comparison to your home country, because you would want to assure that no, these people are coming from an international country, and now they come and exploit your resources like anything, and then they go back eventually after 20 years because there's nothing left here. So you want to make sure that you keep a check on the environmental control also. Now the next one is taxation. Now taxation is basically like, say, whenever a company is entering into your country, right, an international firm coming into India, there are tax treaties that are signed. And those tax treaties are basically, they have certain terms and conditions which would help you to ensure that uh, you are not able to evade, evasion of tax is not possible by a company. You would ensure that, and even the company would ensure that they do not have to pay double tax, right? They will comply the means in the manner that they're paying a certain portion of it here and a certain portion of it in their country back end, but not like they're paying it dual at the same time at both the places. The next is your expropriation and confiscation. Now, this is basically, these are two basic terms, which I guess confiscation is something which you would have heard of. Now, what happens is government of a host country can actually take it or make it a point that they can confiscate the property of the foreign firms if required, if the situation requires. These situations are not like normal conditions, right? There are certain adverse conditions happening in the country, things have gone abruptly wrong, the company is not able to survive or sustain their operations, there has been something very goofy about the business operations of the company and etc. That is the only point when we do something of like that, right? Not in the positive normal working scenarios, right? So you can just confiscate the property of that particular firm without giving them a compensation. And expropriation is when you give them a compensation and you take over their property or their assets. And one more point to add to it is basically expropriation is not something like it's not like you will give them the just and the correct amount for their property. There will be, of course, a negotiation on this aspect also, right? I'll just take a break for 1 minute, and any doubts you can please post on the chat. Any doubts can be posted here, because when I'm speaking, I don't tend to see the chat box because the screen is shared. So if anybody has any query, please post it. If you are comfortable sharing it privately over a message over here in the chat box, please do. I'll take it one by one. Should we move ahead in that case if anybody is not having any certain queries? Okay, I have one point written by somebody here. Uh, US government's restriction on H-1B visa, would it come under an intervention? See, it can, because see what happens generally. US has a different set of rules altogether when it comes to passing on these or passing of these kind of regulations, or making these kind of regulations at any certain point in time. But what happens generally, these visa things not tend to directly affect a company. Please try and understand the difference between the two. When we talk about visa, right, H-1B visa, if I talk about specifically, it's about an individual and it's not about a company, right? And when we're talking about a country risk analysis, in that case, what happens generally, country risk analysis is basically which is related to a company which is operating in a host country, like for example an Indian company operating in USA. And if something goes, if some decisions by the government which are taken and which affects their business in an adverse manner. I hope I have answered like this user US government's query. Now there's another query. Instability of government include coalition government or only frequent change of government? See, coalition जो होती है, till the time it is running smooth, it is not a problem, right? Instability can include both of them, but most of the time when it comes to instability word, if I go by that word and if I go by the readings what I have read in the various textbooks, they often tend to talk about the changes in government. Because see, when one government changes to the another government, what happens generally, you tend to have a different kind of an approach altogether. You don't like the ways and the methods which were followed by any XYZ government previously. You have your own ways of functioning and you feel that is much more superior. And you would have seen that ab jaisa bhi BJP power mein hai, right? There are certain cases which are coming up which went wrong in the UPA time, right? So things like that keep happening. So coalition में both can be, like the instability can of course comprise of both. Coalition में भी अगर कोई problem आएगी and people withdraw themselves back, like this case which has happened very recently in the state government, was something because of that only the coalition got broke, and then eventually the party had to let down their seats. I hope I'm clear. Anybody, any doubt further, please share. Should we move ahead? Okay, we will move ahead now with the next part. I mean, continuation to it. Okay. We had completed with analysis of political risk. Now, analysis, like this is just a brief line about, sorry, a brief about what we have discussed so far in detail. So when we talk about the political analysis, political risk analysis, the basic purpose of it is to anticipate the future political events which might happen in a country, right? So it is like you're trying your best to judge for what could happen next in that particular political environment. Now, there are two types, like we have somewhat talked about these major political, both evolutionary political changes, right, and major discontinuities in the political system. These are the major 2 points which leads to, or which needs to be monitored by any investor. That investor can be an individual, that investor can be a foreign firm who's willing to invest into India being the host country. Now evolutionary political changes would comprise of कि अभी present situation क्या है, and what could be the future course of action, or if you are able to like see forecast for any kind of directions of change. Now when elections are very nearby, right, during that time you do not see any new investments happening. मैं ये नहीं कह रही कि एग्जिस्टिंग इन्वेस्टमेंट्स नहीं होती हैं, वो काम चल रहे हैं, वो चलते रहेंगे, दो नोबडी स्टॉप्स ऑन दैट फ्रंट, बट यू वुड सी फॉर दैट पर्टिकुलर फेज फॉर another 5 to 6 months, when you know that you never know which party would come into power. Sometimes it's very certain that no XYZ party, a BJP would come into power, or Congress would come into power. At that time things would be different, but when you know there's a strong kind of a question who's going to come next, in that scenario people, or I should say the investors, would not be keen in investing during that particular phase, because they are very unsure about the fact about what would be the possible directions of change. Now the next one is major discontinuities. Now the major discontinuities are basically overthrows of the established government can be a threat to the existent foreign firms, because what happens is the collaborations which are made by one party may not be liked by the other party. I'll give an example. What happens generally when it comes to government works, no, there are most of the things which are done on tender basis and etc. Right. Now I'm not talking about small tenders. There are big tenders also for certain construction purposes and etc. too. Now these things are given to a certain set of parties, and there's a whole background which goes behind how a tender is given to a person or to a company. But what the fact of the matter is, we everybody of us knows that there are at times there's a lot of loopholes in allocating a tender to a certain party, right? So if I was into, if I'm talking about UPA government has given a tender to an XYZ party which they wanted to favor, right? I'm not taking terms of parties, but you can actually relate to situations like these which have happened in that particular term. So if UPA has favored a particular company by giving them a tender, right, and later when BJP comes into power, they want to literally tell them that what you did was wrong. There's a scandal there, right? So the discontinuities in the long run can be something which can be of threat to the MNCs. Now, the process of evaluating political risk consists of the following steps. So basically, like the ways we had done yesterday, like the different basic qualifications for analyzing country risk. Similarly, we have the factors, or I can say the basic points which one has to take into consideration before evaluating or in the process of evaluating political risk. Right. So the first one is basically you need to understand the type of government that is presently in power in that foreign country. Right. You cannot actually exclude that particular point. That is quite an essential point. The next one is analyze the characteristics of your products. Now, what happens generally, not every, like we did discuss a certain portion of it yesterday also, but right now, I would just want to throw a light on this particular aspect that not every company would get affected by the political risks which are existing into that particular host country, right? It directly depends upon the kind of product you're dealing into, the kind of services, operations you need to maintain, and accordingly you have to watch for your political risk. It's not like your political risk are standard to all kind of firms, right? If your firm is something who's dealing into pharmaceutical, in that case the kind of risk could be quite different for you in comparison to somebody who's producing, say, socks, right? So the third point is identify and evaluate the sources of potential risk. That's very obvious. And the last one is projecting the probabilities in the time frames of potential risk. What happens is you were able to identify it well that this is a possible risk which you are able to anticipate, but in that case you will have to evaluate it in terms of like to what extent is it able to going to disrupt your business, and what particular time frame is it going to affect you, right? So it basically means it is not going to be there for lifelong. No, that risk is going to be for another year and a half, or a two, or something of that sort. And if you can actually sustain that time period, then you can of course go ahead with your work or your project, right? Next, we have the environment of political risk. Please repeat point one. Just a minute, please. To gain a clear understanding of the type of government that is presently in power in the foreign country. See, not every country, if for example, there's a firm based out of an XYZ country, say Europe or America or anywhere, is coming into India. India is a host country to it, right? Now, every government has a very different ideology, right? What happens is there's certain people who would want to be proactively increasing FDI, certain people in the government, and there's another set of people who would not want to work on that front. So you have to actually be very uh, be very aware about the kind of government you are going to interact with. And on the other front, because you just initiated with this question, I'm just able to recollect a point also. See the kind of monitoring that is there on an international firm that is not there on a domestic form. I'm not saying कि होती है और नहीं होती, ऐसा नहीं है कि domestic में नहीं होती और international पे होती है. It's not like that. The degree of monitoring that is there on an international firm is quite different from your domestic firm. And from that perspective, you have to be very sure about the fact that is this particular government going to favor you when things go wrong, or help you on like going out of the box and going to help you with it, or is it like very stringent with the rules and regulation and things are going to become very difficult in the long run. So from this perspective, you need to ensure that you on the personal front as a company need to be on good terms with the government. That's kind of a very odd statement, but that's the truth when it comes to international business. Now, the next point which we have is, now the process is something which we have completed, right? Now, the next slide which we have is the environment of political risk. Now, the environment of political risk is again dependent upon two factors: the ideology and the international law. And the person who asked about the first point as a doubt, again, this ideology part would actually answer your query to the best, I should say. So, when we're talking about the political risks which are originating are basically which would have their origination from two perspectives: ideology and international law. Ideology basically means that what kind of normal basic characteristics the government holds in that particular country. And when I'm talking about communism, it is basically an extreme form of socialism, right? So when we're talking about communism में basically क्या होता है? The government is the ownership and basically operating all the factors of production, right? And you will see that the private corporation, right, from maybe a non-communist country may not be allowed to actually own a plant in a communism, or I should say a communist country, right? So communism is basically an extreme form of socialism in which you have the major holding by the government. That is the thing, right? Now when we're talking about socialism, now this particular thing is being followed in your country, that is India, in our country, that is India. So basically, like socialism is also referred to as mixed economy also in certain times, right? At certain times. So when we're talking about socialism, it is basically about government ownership and control of the factors of production. But the thing is, the private sector is allowed to operate. That is not like the private sectors are not operating. But if you see a scenario in India, the private sectors were allowed to participate firstly in the non-key sectors, and eventually you see that there's a liberalization towards that aspect also. Very few areas have been left now to the only government sector. And now, when we talk about capitalism, it is basically an ideology in which the private ownership of the factors of production is taking place, right? But that private ownership of production, if that is taking place, it ensures that the public interest is protected. ऐसा नहीं है कि ठीक है कि अगर सब कुछ जो है productions and etc is into private ownership, so they're exploiting them or exploiting the people like anything. It's not like that. In capitalism also, the interest of the people have to be taken into consideration, else the economy would collapse at a very massive pace, right? Now, this is the basic definitions which I told you for communism, socialism, and capitalism. Now, how are they related to a risk context? See, what happens is the kind of ideology your government has, right? Accordingly, they will liberalize the economy, right? And accordingly, when they will liberalize the economy, the policies of the trade would be formulated. Now, if you remember, there's a foreign trade policy for India, there's a foreign trade policy likewise for every other country, right? Now, when we design these foreign trade policies, and for that reason, any XYZ policy which is decided by the government, it is on the front or it is based on the ideology which the government holds, right? It's not like your basic values are different and what you write on paper is different. There has to be a matching between the same. Now, the second is your international law. Now, sovereignty is the first point. This particular point refers to the degree to which a country attempts to control its own economy. Now, what happens is there are very small countries in this world also which are into the stage of underdevelopment at the moment. And you will see that various MNCs are like somebody who can actually overpower that economy's power also. I mean, we have firms like Apple, we have firms like Microsoft, we have these huge, huge international firms who are far superior than an economy of an underdeveloped country, right? So, in that context, you have to, as a government of that country, has to ensure that you do not let that situation happen, right? And if something is going wrong, there is a process of confiscation or confirmation which we have studied. Like we can actually execute the power of the government and take over the property of the private firms that are operating, the international private firms that are operating. Now, the next point is international treaties. There are two types of treaties that are generally tend to talked about. When a treaty is signed between two nations, that is known as a bilateral or a multilateral thing, right? Bilateral between two countries. But when a treaty is signed between two or more countries, it is known as multilateral. Now, these treaties are basically the points of execution, or I should say, the points wherein details are mentioned about your taxation and tax evasion and everything, right? So, it is something which is again essential, right? If the international treaties are very stringent, the tax repatriation points are something which are of a concern, the country would not want to actually operate in the host country. The next point, which is very, very important, is intellectual property rights. What happens is there are another set of firms which are having a extreme good set of international, what do we say, patents and etc. I mean, their product designs are quite good and etc. So what happens generally, they would always want to protect those things, right? Every company would want to do, whether it is a domestic or an international firm. But when an international firm is operating in your country and you do not give a proper legal system to actually protect their patents and etc., what would happen, or protect their processes and etc., what would happen? They would feel that that's not a very unbiased, they would feel that that's a very biased kind of a situation for them, in the sort they would not feel it very comfortable to operate in a country like that. वो एक confidence ही नहीं आएगा, उनको लगेगा at any point in time anybody can actually take over my this competitive advantage and just copy to any extent, and then that would be a problem. So intellectual property rights के जो legalization procedures होते हैं, that have to be mentioned in detail and very clear from the government, the host government's side. The next is business conflicts. Now, business conflicts are something which could happen from for various reasons, right? Business conflicts basically tend to happen from the operational perspective, because what happens when the international firm comes in, they have they are actually of this opinion that they know the market in and out, they will be able to operate and excel and etc. But we have seen a lot of firms entering into the operation into the Indian market, realizing that the Indian market is quite different because there's a quite a mixed variety of people here. So they have to change their strategy, maybe sometimes their product range also. So that tends to happen. Now, these things can be resolved by three measures, that is adaptation, renegotiation, and mediation. Now, when you're talking about adaptation, adaptation is basically you tend to change the pricing thing, or you tend to change your, what do we say, the delivery schedule things. You adapt to the situation of that particular country. So, that is something which would reduce your level of conflict and actually would reduce your risk considerably. Renegotiation would mean basically that maybe a new contract is actually coming into place in comparison to the previous contract, because things were not what you were able to actually judge for in the initial go. So there's a kind of a renegotiation happening on those fronts. Next, then, and the next one is mediation. Now, mediation is basically what, a third party coming in and helping you to resolve your conflict. The third party generally in the mediation process is not the um, like your courts, of course, but there are other agencies which come into and take things into matlab, and resolve your things. The last one, the last point which we talk about is the local laws. Now, abiding by the laws of both the host and the home country. See, it's very easy to say that your business is into in number of countries and operating there, but trust me, it is hell of a difficulty to manage an international business. Import export is still a very minor portion of international business. It is not actually trying to show you a very true picture of what happens otherwise when you have a subsidiary being opened up there and operations being happening there. So what happens is you need to actually ensure that you are abiding by the laws of the home country also, and as well as the host country too. So these are like the environment in which the political risks have to actually be perceived. Now the last topic, which is management of political risk. I would need a 1 minute break, please. Any doubts can be asked. Now, when there are two doubts which have come in, I would just address one by one. Can you please explain the point of business conflict with respect to political risk? See, political risk is a kind of a bigger picture, right? uh, Again, which is divided into two portions, which we had studied, the evolutionary thing. Okay, the way we perceive the current situation of the government which is existing and the future directions. And the second aspect to it is the major discontinuities that would happen. Now, when we are talking about business conflicts generally tend to happen on the operational front, right? And when things change, for example, I'll just give you a very weird example over here. When GST came into action, right? That was a government decision. That government decision tended to affect a lot of businesses that were operating, right? So that is a kind of a decision taken by the government which affects the businesses. Likewise, when there's any kind of decision taken on a international front which would affect a lot of MNCs in their operations, that could be a kind of a business conflict also, right? So the MNCs on that front can actually say that this was nowhere mentioned in our agreement or a contract which we had done earlier. So then we would adapt to the situation, like we can just renegotiate on the contract terms which were built earlier, because the situation is now very different, right? So I hope I have answered the query from that business conflict with respect to political risk. There's one more query: how MNCs would react how MNCs would react to cases of economic offenders like Vijay Mallya and Nirav Modi before investing? Very good question, I should say. See, what happens generally, these are exceptions. I mean, I should not say that, but that's the reality. What happens generally, MNCs would, of course, on media, when if I talk about any MNC, they always have a PR person who addresses the media for any XYZ thing. And of course, the board of directors do that whenever required. But they, of course, condemn that particular thing. They can never be in favor of anything that like that happening. They would always say that this is something which is not expected. There has to be a stringent corporate governance thing happening, and etc. We have been trying hard on ensuring that the corporate governance is something which comes into practice more rigorously into the corporations, and things like these do not happen again. So on the face of media and etc., they would literally condemn that point that this should not happen. But otherwise, trust me, they don't go by these things, because as an economy, India as a country is something which is quite a beneficial place to invest, irrespective of things like this happening, because we are a big population with a huge big demand and a decent enough government and a good, I should say, like good enough infra than most of the countries, but yet lagging behind the developed countries, of course. So I hope I have answered your query also. Anybody else, any other query, please let me know. This class has extended beyond my imagination, so sorry for stretching to that limit, but I would really want to complete this topic in another 5 or 10 minutes now. And I hope you would cooperate with me, because you have no option. You cannot speak also. You can just write your concerns. If at all anybody is like running out of time or anything, that's not another 5 minutes and we'll just wind up with this topic. I'll just share the screen again. Now, we were on this point: management of political risk. Now, management of political risk is something which is quite an interesting thing, actually. See, I know when, like the topic we have discussed so far, it seems that the MNCs are always on the begging side, but it's not like that, right? And the governments are looking or appearing out to be quite superior. But when I'm talking otherwise, that's not the true story, right? It's like a 50-50 thing. It's a win-win approach. If a person, sorry, if an MNC invests into India, right, the government of India also benefits, the MNC also benefits. It's a win-win situation for both the parties, right? I'll just address to that issue in a while, please. So we were talking about the requirement. We were talking about the hedging. That is actually the thing. So we were talking about that it's a win-win situation for any firm to take into consideration. Now, hedging is something which is treated as a risk reducing strategy. And hedging originally is something which is more related to finance, right? So you would have actually studied this in detail in, I suppose, financial management also. But from the perspective of international business and what is their advantage and etc., I'll just explain it. Now, hedging is basically helping you to reduce the risk, and as an investor, how can you actually manage the political risk which are arising out of a country? So the following strategies which are pointed down, right, can be taken by an investor. Now, a firm may minimize its equity investment in the foreign country. This is a very interesting point. See, what happens generally when I'm coming into another host country, for example, a brand or a firm from outside, say Germany, coming into India, has two options: either to invest in the form of equity with an existing player, right? That will be something they would always wish for, to actually join hand with someone, because otherwise when it comes like entering into a greenfield investment, it becomes quite a difficult for international brand, right? So when there are strategic alliances, joint ventures, mergers and acquisitions happening, so most of the times equity is involved. But if you want to actually play this game on a back front, if I should say, like very safely, in that scenario what can be done is basically you would want that rather than investing in the form of equity, you would go for loans, right? Or either you would go for a venture in which you will have less of equity and not a complete level of like say equity involvement. अगर यही मैं decide करती being an investor of Germany investing into India, and I would have wanted to open up a wholesale subsidiary of mine, then direct equity would have been mine. If I would have gone in for a joint venture, वो कहीं ना कहीं थोड़ा सा तो परसेंटेजेस में डिफरेंस आ जाता, या मैं एक लोन ले सकती हूँ, लोन लेकर उसी को जब वहां पे प्रॉफिट्स होंगे उसी की करेंसी में उसको पे ऑफ कर दूंगी, तब भी एडवांटेज हो जाएगा. तो दिस इज अ वे ऑफ हाउ यू कैन रिड्यूस योर रिस्क to a certain extent. Now, when we are talking about the second point, that is international integration of productions helps reduce political risk. Now, international, I can see a message on the chat box. I would just take it in a while, please. I would want to finish with this slide. Now, when we're talking about international integration of production helps reduce political risk, right? Now, what happens generally, you would see that a lot of firms have that particular, a lot of governments have that particular thing like you have to have the procurement of certain goods done from the host country, right? So that kind of thing is also able to help you, as in the international integration of production helps to reduce political risk in the perspective of a host country is less likely to take over a foreign firm which is dependent for raw materials actually onto them only. I would prefer, like, see what happens when a government in the host country tries to overpower a firm. They would have to actually select for somebody who's procuring resources, manpower based out of the host country only, or somebody who's actually procuring more of the resources from outside. तो ज्यादा खतरा किसको है? जो बाहर से कर रहा है procure, जो यहीं से कर रहा है procure, उसको थोड़ा सा कम risk होने की chances है in terms of interventions, because they are kind of favoring your economy also. They are giving you good employment to the people. They are helping you to get your raw materials absorbed in the form of raw material into the company. The third one which we have is international firm can seek guarantees from the host governments before making investment, right? This is like a kind of documentation only. It's not like verbally, but a certain set of guarantees that you intend to help us with any kind of adverse situation and etc happening or anything of that sort. So guarantees are taken from that perspective. The last one is an international firm can take insurance cover for political risk. There are certain agencies like हमारे individual insurance policies भी होती है ना, वैसे ही there are agencies which would help cover companies also for the kind of political risk which would come out based out of any economy, but there are a lot of conditions attached to it, right? So international firm would even tend to take that too, and that is taking like a proactive measure. आज अगर हम for an individual, if he or she has taken a mediclaim or an insurance policy, that is a proactive measure that is being implemented by that individual to secure his or her life, right? Similarly, if an international firm takes an insurance for the political risk, it's a proactive measure which is taken. So these points which are written right on this particular slide is something which an investor can do prior to when the investment is made. I hope I'm clear. I'll just see to the chat now. That is what we are trying to say. There's a query that equity is more liquid. So isn't equity less risky? Equity is more liquid, we get that. But when it comes to investing, you would always prefer, see, आपके पास अगर ऑप्शन है 100% अपना पैसा लगाना या 49% अपना पैसा लगाना एक ऐसी मार्केट में जिसके बारे में अभी आपको अननोन है वो मार्केट, बेटा रिसर्च तो सारे करते हैं, मैं ये नहीं कह रही वो इतनी बड़ी फर्म है मार्केट रिसर्च का पूरा अपना एक डिपार्टमेंट होगा, पूरी थरो रिसर्च होती है, पर जो चीज बाहर से दिखती है और जब उस कंट्री में आते हो एन नंबर ऑफ प्रॉब्लम्स आती हैं। लाइक वेज यू हैव स्टडीड द सब्जेक्ट ईडी, जब हम सोचते हैं कि हम अपना स्टार्टअप बनाएंगे और जब हम एक्चुअली में मार्केट में उतरते हैं उस स्टार्टअप को एग्जीक्यूट करने के लिए, उसके ऑपरेशंस को एग्जीक्यूट करने के लिए n number of problems आती हैं, right? So coming back to what you said, equity is of course more liquid, so it is really easy to pull it off and etc. But बात अभी यहाँ पर आ रही है अपनी इक्विटी कम यूज करना। एक रिस्की पोजीशन है, 100% इक्विटी डालना है, 49% इक्विटी डालना, तो हम प्रेफर करते हैं 49% डालना, बाकी काम लोन से कर लेना कि लोन जो होगा हम वो पे ऑफ भी कर देंगे उसी की नेशनल करेंसी में जब हम क्या कहते हैं उसको ऑपरेशंस रन करेंगे तब। देयर इज अनदर डाउट बाय समबडी, please shed some light on the political campaign management companies and their relation with this topic. Political campaign management companies, I honestly am not able to understand this question. Please shed some light on the political campaign management companies and their relation with this topic. The concerned person, if you can just reframe your question a bit and ask me, that will be quite an ease for me also. Taking the next query now. How do we, ma'am, how do international organizations such as WTO help in global risk aversion among countries? See, WTO का भी जो role है ना, they have their contracts. अब वो again, we were coming to the role of WTO also. That is on the next slide of when hedging can be taken into consideration after the investment has been made. अभी जो हमने points पढ़े थे, जो present slide पे थे, वो सारे points हम तब follow करते हैं जब हमने इन्वेस्टमेंट अभी करनी है, मतलब वी आर ऑलमोस्ट ऑन द वर्ज ऑफ डूइंग एन इन्वेस्टमेंट। अब डब्ल्यूटीओ का रोल क्या आता है कि दे हेल्प द इंटरनेशनल कंपनीज इन एक्चुअली helping them know about the situations, right? Helping them get associated with the right set of people sometimes, and also they have certain rules and etc which actually are proposing to the fact that if things go wrong, there is a thing called as cancellation of a contract also. That's also a possibility. But again, just understanding this brief line is not sufficient. There are n number of regulations, or I should say aspect attached to it, कि WTO कब ऐसी रेगुलेशन को एप्लीकेशन में लाने की इजाजत देगा कब नहीं देगा, there's a whole sum of story behind it, right? So I hope I've answered your query for the time being. And the next query is, there are some companies that undertake the political campaigns, अच्छा, in a country during the time of elections. Which companies? I mean, if you could just help me with any one of few names. And if at all it's anything like that, they are clearly, I mean, showing that they are more oriented towards a particular set of government and that particular ideology. So there's nothing as such related to it. I mean, that's, I don't want to actually bring certain parties names into it, but just for a reference purpose, we know that BJP government is quite very closely related to the Ambanis and etc. Right? So what happens if वैसे तो मैंने आज तक ऐसा कुछ देखा नहीं है कि people from Reliance are advertising for क्या कहते हैं BJP or anything of that sort. So I'm not very sure about this particular thing which you're asking me. And if at all, like if at all on a impersonal level also, if somebody is doing it, that's absolutely their personal choice if they want to show their ideology that they have a bent towards that XYZ party. Now there's another query. What if there is a difference of opinion between the state and central government? How will it affect IB? So basically, when we are talking about see, when we are talking about the difference of opinions, what happens generally, um, the government, the central government always wins in comparison to the state government. And because see, when it comes to deciding policies for your international business, these are decided on the country level perspective. And trust me guys, it is never like that ki the states and the central moves in the opposite directions when it comes to deciding of policies. I know otherwise अगर सेंट्रल में गवर्नमेंट है और किसी स्टेट में कांग्रेस की गवर्नमेंट है, ऑफ कोर्स वो थोड़ा सा रिटेलिएशन रहता ही है, बट all in good work they have to decide on certain aspects. And कहीं ना कहीं एक मेजोरिटी पर्सपेक्टिव भी रहता है कि मेजोरिटी ऑफ द स्टेट्स हैव अग्रीड टू द कंसिडरेशन एंड वी हैव टू प्रोसीड विद इट, राइट? और ऐसा नहीं है कि स्टेट की चीज स्टेट की, अगर फॉर एग्जांपल एज अ स्टेट गवर्नमेंट आई हैव रिप्रेजेंटेड अ कंसर्न, that would be of course addressed, but ultimately it is the center who's deciding on these kind of policies. And otherwise also one more thing, इन सब चीज़ों के लिए अलग-अलग डिपार्ट वो होते हैं, क्या कहते हैं, गवर्निंग बॉडीज़ होती हैं, एंड पीपल हू आर एक्चुअली ऑपरेटिंग इन दीज़ गवर्निंग बॉडीज़ आर इंडिपेंडेंट पीपल. They are majorly said to be non-affected by either of the parties of the center and the state, right? So to a certain extent, we can eradicate biasness coming from these particular kind of decisions. Now there's a link which is being shared. I'll have to open that link. Just wait for a while. There's Aditya, the link which you have shared with her. I'll have to go through it. I cannot really comment on it just looking by the headline. I'll have to go through it in detail and then only I'll be able to say anything about it. There's one more query by somebody. What if there is a president or governor rule in a state like in Jammu and Kashmir? So, I mean, what is your query? What if, I mean, that's not a big deal. We have Jammu and Kashmir and things are quite dealing well in that particular state. What's the query? I mean, you want to understand this particular question into, you want to ask this question into what context? How does it affect or what? In context to IB, you want to understand. So, but in context to IB also, that's absolutely fine. I mean, that's a scenario and that is an acceptable scenario. ऐसा नहीं है कि president और governor rule में होने से state कोई मतलब ऐसा नहीं है कि it goes out of the track or anything of that sort. There have been situations like that when the governor has come to the ruling and there is like presidential rule also. That's absolutely a normal situation. It is considered to be a normal situation because we have seen incidents like this happening. And of course, when we are talking about Jammu and Kashmir, it's been into like this for a good number of times into that particular power. And again, when I have mentioned that in context to IB only, there are certain autonomous agencies which take decisions into that respect in consideration to the central and the state. And when these autonomous agencies or committees are operating, they take into confidence everybody. मतलब वो suggestion सबसे देते हैं, सुनती सबकी हैं, पर फिर कहते हैं ना कि they are the expertise when it comes to economy and foreign business. So they decide on factors accordingly. So we need not actually worry on that front, right? Now let me please complete the last मतलब last slide of the topic, please. But I would want to appreciate one thing. I've never ever had so many queries in the class also. So I really appreciate that you people are taking interest in studying. Thank you so much for that. Now, the next, or I should say the last slide, and then we have thank you. Hmm. Now, we are talking about hedging after investment. And if at all there's any query, don't worry, I'll just take it after completing the slide. I'm not running away. So basically, now hedging after investment. Now, in this, the first point is it can act as a good corporate citizen. Corporate citizen. Now, what happens is, ये ऐसी situation है, investor ने investment कर दी. Investor means again a company has already invested. Things have gone considerably wrong, or the government is trying to intervene and make things difficult and etc. So things are not very positive in short, right? Either it is from the government's perspective, or naturally things are not going in favor because the certain policies have been changed or etc. So what can the investor still do to save himself and to reduce his risk? मैं ये नहीं कि हम कहीं पर भी ये बात नहीं कर रहे, रिस्क एवर्जन की बात नहीं हो रही है, रिस्क मिनिमाइजेशन की बात हो रही है. हेजिंग रिस्क को मिनिमाइज करता है, खत्म नहीं कर सकता, right? So the first is it can act as a good corporate citizen. And when we're talking about a good corporate citizen, it is basically tending to say that the company can make the government realize that I am doing so good to you. I am using your raw materials, right? I am using another say 70% of raw materials from the country itself, originally originated from India, right? They can tell you, the MNCs, the investors can tell you that I am helping you increase your GDP by another say 0.8%, or 0.8% increase in GDP by a attributed to a single company. It's a very big deal, right? So I'm helping you increase your foreign exchange reserves. So I'm very good. I mean, do not try to interfere into my operations, or do not create a kind of a hell kind of a situation for me. I'm helping you do good in all these things, and what's that which is a matter of concern to you, right? The second one is negotiating tactfully on the basis of their technological and other capabilities. If the government makes it difficult to actually help you operate or do operations in that particular host country, what you can say is, then gradually you will have to transfer your technology to an other country, and with that you will not be able to help India, maybe for that reason, for any kind of technological transfers in the future. So it is like kind of you are being tactfully able to handle the situation, like the kind of technological development which you have had, right? The host government has been having for this while this particular MNC was operating here. You will not have that any longer if you push me out of the market, of your Indian market, right? Now employment to the host country people, you can take that particular advantage, no, that you're employing so many people. Once if I take out my operations, right, or आज की date में, for that reason Microsoft or Apple or etc., they have so many offices in India, like so big offices in India. Google has a good office in India, right? So if they pull out their operations and etc., people would become unemployed, right? Pulling out operations from a particular country would mean that they would not want to operate in that country, right? कितनों को साथ लेकर जाएंगे जॉब करने के लिए, ठीक है? अगर किसी को कहते हैं कि नहीं तुम बहुत अच्छे एम्प्लॉय हो, तुम हमारे साथ जाके फलाना XYZ कंट्री में काम कर लेना, कोई गूगल में काम भी करता होगा तो वो चला भी जाएगा कि यार इतनी अच्छी कंपनी है, बट कितने लोगों को लेकर जाओगे, राइट? So that is a concern. Private insurance covers may be taken. That is basically if the government is not providing you with any kind of an insurance cover, or is not providing you with any kind of an assurance, right? Assurance treaty नहीं कोई हुई है या कुछ भी है, तो अब एक private insurance cover ले लो for the risk, for the political risk which we have just discussed in the previous slide. Now over here UN, IMF, WTO comes into action, that they have investment codes. There was a query also on the previous aspect, somebody asked. UN IMF promotes investment codes that provide reciprocal guarantees between MNC and the host government. Now, this particular point is something which has a lot of conditions attached to it. It proposes that you can actually take back your operations, or whatever the agreements have been taken, agreements have been made, can be actually taken back, right? But that provision is in the exceptional of exceptional cases, not like कि भाई वो market recession में गई और आपने अपना operations call back कर लिए, ऐसे नहीं हो सकता. There are certain specific conditions which we have to study in detail depending upon economic to economy situation, right? And next one is the voluntary divestment. Divestment is basically the action and process of selling of a subsidiary business of yours, right? You would say that if like for example, the government makes it very difficult, or the political situation is abruptly against you, you plan of selling off a part of your subsidiary to a domestic firm maybe, राइट? तुम ये नहीं कह रहे कि हम बिल्कुल, मतलब ऐसा नहीं है कि 100% सेल ऑफ कर दोगे। हो सकता है कि अपना पार्ट जो है इक्विटी का उसको फर्दर लिक्विडेट कर दो। मतलब अगर तुम्हारे पास पहले 49 था, तुम अब कहो कि चलो मैं 30 तक ही ओके हूँ, तो द अदर कंपनी whom you were into association with would want to take the other part of the share and etc. So that is an option. So these are ways you can reduce your risk when you've already made an investment, right? So I we have finished with this topic, and again I'm repeating it, for this particular topic you have to refer to CB Gupta. ये इतनी डिटेल जितनी हमने पढ़ी है ना इस टॉपिक के लिए, मोर देन इनफ है फॉर यू, राइट? द स्पाइरल विच यू हैव, ए एंड बी सेक्शन हैज अ स्पाइरल, उसमें कंट्री रिस्क एनालिसिस जो है वीके भल्ला से है, पर वो बहुत ज्यादा डिटेल में, इससे ज्यादा डिटेल में अभी आपको पढ़ने की जरूरत नहीं है, बीइंग अ ग्रेजुएट स्टूडेंट. Now, if anybody has any query, you can please write on the chat box. The business model of these companies is to manage the election campaigns of the clients, mainly political parties. Okay. I'll have to read through it honestly, because this is something new to me. I'm being very honest. And we see that we have a reduced number of participants. So if anybody has a query, we can just share it, right? I am just unmuting you all. Please let me know. Anybody any query? So that's all, right? We have finished with this topic, and now this is something done from my side for this particular week, right? And you guys will be receiving presentations from Jatin sir also and Deepika ma'am also. This is my humble request to all of you. Please make it a point to go through your PPTs and etc. Because we honestly, I don't know. I mean, the previous time I met you last week, I was saying ki we hope to meet on 15, but seeing the scenario in the country, that's quite unpredictable at the moment, and it's quite seeing that we might not be able to meet on 15th. I hope. I mean, मेरे को तो नहीं लग रहा कॉलेज खुलेगा. बाकी I don't know. Let's wait for the HRD ministry's proper comments. And another thing, you can expect that soon after colleges reopen, आप लोगों के एग्जाम्स ही हो जाएंगे सीधा शायद. तो भाई उस सिचुएशन के लिए भी तैयार रहो. ये ना हो कि थर्ड ईयर है, सबसे ज्यादा क्रूशियल चीज आप लोगों के लिए है और किसी के लिए नहीं है. First to second year still manageable. The third year is going to suffer if at all, because मेन टास्क वुड बी थर्ड ईयर के पेपर लेना सबसे प्रायोरिटी बेसिस पे, और उसका रिजल्ट देना कि वो बंदे आगे अपनी जॉब्स में भी जा पाए, और जिसको एमबीए में एडमिशन लेनी है वहां पे भी जा पाए. सो प्लीज इंश्योर दैट यू आर सीरियसली गोइंग थ्रू द पीपीटीज. दैट इज द minimum we can expect from you people, right? Thank you so much. Take good care for yourself and for your family too. Bye bye. Good day.